Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 484th New Social Environment. I'm Anya, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Esther Kläs and Tom McGlynn. We're thrilled to welcome the poet Abigail Welhouse here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter and that here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We encourage you to check the chat for a living document of resources and actions, which I will post shortly. And now to introduce today's guest and host. Artist Esther Kläs graduated from the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf and received an MFA from Hunter College, New York. She currently lives and works in Barcelona, Spain. Museums exhibitions include the subtle interplay between the I and the me, Esther Kläs, Maybe It Can Be Different, and Esther Kläs START Center for Contemporary Art, among many others. Artist, writer, and independent curator Tom McGlynn is based in the New York City area. His work is represented in the permanent collections of the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Modern Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum of the Smithsonian. He's the director of Beautiful Fields, an organization dedicated to socially engaged curatorial projects, and is also a visiting lecturer at Parsons School of Design at the New School. He holds an MFA from Hunter College and a BFA from the Ramapo College of New Jersey, and he's editor-at-large for the Brooklyn Rail. So please take it away.
Thank you, Anya. And it's my pleasure to both have seen Esther's show at Peter Blum last Thursday, where I got a chance to talk to Esther, which was very helpful in preparing for this discussion. So yeah, it was interesting in being in this space with the sculptures and talking to Esther. I think we immediately kind of established that we didn't want to overanalyze the work, maybe in a traditional critical way. And, I hope that tenor kind of informs this discussion as well. But, nevertheless, there's a lot of things, of course, that are adjacent, already adjacent to the work that will come up. But I want to respect Esther's intent on letting the viewer, experience the work firsthand, and then make up their own assumptions about it. But of course, I have a lot of ideas and some historical context. For one, Esther mentioned that, at the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf that she studied with Georg Herold, and it made me think of my initial experience, actually my initial trip to Germany in 1986 was to the Cologne Art Fair, and I had the opportunity to visit Max Hetzler Gallery, which was located in Cologne at the time. And I came upon my first Georg Herold, and I remember being taken by his work in terms of his relationship to materiality and to presence. And now I asked Esther about his influence, and maybe we can begin there. Esther, do you want to talk about your relationship to Georg Herold, just to kind of set this up in some sort of art historical context?
Yeah. For me, it was more than, there's something like you study with somebody and then you see their work and you like the work. And yes, I liked his work, but more than that, I felt the way he was. And the way he was with us students, and that was so freeing. He was there and he would let us be, and he would, I just not maybe talk for others, but for myself, that it was his way of leaning back and looking at what there is in the world and observing it, and then making a comment on that. And that inspired that there was not a need for you have to explain or you have to be sure or you know exactly and you have to prove, and you could just take your own point of view on things.
Right. You mentioned
So,
his open
yeah.
open quality. Can we take a look at that one example of the Georg Herald? He's not as well known, I think, in the United States as he is in Europe and Germany. Actually, I think this is the exact piece that I saw. It's in the collection of MoMA now, but
Yeah.
this is the exact piece that I saw at Max Hetzler. And, you know, at the time I was discussing the kind of resurgence of importance of arte povera in European art in relation to American art, which at the time was, you know, Hetzler was also showing Jeff Koons. So there's a completely different relationship to materiality between the Americans and the Germans at the time. And it seemed like a crux of kind of cross-Atlantic discussion about, you know, presence in art, presence and absence in art. Just because, you know, this is so, the materials are so humble. It's just like wire and cloth. And there's a similarity to some extent in your humble materials, Esther, in particular in the two floor pieces, which are Random Beauty and Come Again. So maybe we can segue to those two pieces that are in the current show at Peter Blum. We could start there. Yeah, let's start here. I think this is a good one to start with. So not to put too fine a point on my critique, maybe you can discuss this a bit, Esther? Yeah. Maybe in relation to materiality and presence and whatever.
Well, in general, materiality for me is, I choose a material for, I want to do something, and then I am thinking about which material I could use best. So every time, so there's always a lot of different materials that I use. And when there's an exhibition like this one, there's plenty of different materials. And every time, yeah, really to not make it more complicated than it already is, you know? So I would use, in this, it's bronze on the floor, and then it's bamboo and painted wood sticks. And yeah, it's I don't know, would you like to know more about that piece itself, or?
Well,
because I think,
yeah, sure. I mean, whatever.
I think to talk about this piece, for example, it's easier to speak about that installation that there is.
Okay, you know, can we see a wider shot? And yeah, can we see like a larger shot of that? Yeah. That's probably good, right?
Well, I think there's one image where you have, there's three pieces, three different sculptures. They're all on the floor and all have the same grid, basically, and then have a sculpture next to them.
Right, there's Come Again and Random Beauty and that other piece with the concrete.
Yeah, block. Exactly, yeah.
But,
yeah.
I can pull up that image. Just give me one moment.
Is Esther, is Random Beauty the one with the cloth?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so that's the one we're missing. Just the Random Beauty slide.
But what I was interested in this particular installation was it was all about scale. You know, more than materiality, for example, in this one. And if you see the other works in the exhibition, it's all connected to some sort of human scale. And in that kind of most recent body of work, let's say, there's a shift of scale to something that doesn't connect right away to the human body as the other ones. So it's like a shift in looking and shift in perceiving what we see. That in order to see it, we have to change maybe our viewpoint.
Yes, I think in the gallery when I saw, not this one, but Come Again, you know, I mentioned kind of that there might be an anecdotal reference to, for instance, just off the top of my head, like equestrian competition in that format of those dowels, those blue dowels, you know, suspended between two pieces of bamboo. And in this piece, there's also, for me, there was like an anecdotal association to, say, maybe like Japanese culture in terms of the maybe pennants in flag. So like the scale, like I think what you're saying is like, you know, there's the viewer who's present in the gallery interacting with the floor piece, but then the standing piece has kind of a more of a scale model effect. It did for me as a viewer.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a tension between, you know, the scale model and the actual in the gallery.
But so do you see it, when you see it, do you think that there should be something bigger? Do you imagine there might be a bigger piece existing somewhere else, or it is what you see is what it is?
Well, you know, in my research, Esther, I was again going back into, you know, the difference between, say, like the history of German contemporary sculpture and, say, American contemporary sculpture. So if we think, for instance, about Joel Shapiro's kind of groundbreaking shows at Paula Cooper, where he had these like tiny houses, you know, he shifted the whole discussion of minimalism to this scale issue, but made them tiny, you know, so the viewers immediately projected into this other kind of virtual world. For me, the ambiguity of this is what's interesting, like the ambiguity between the scale model and the piece that's the cast piece on the floor, which feels more like evidence of the actual than the standing bamboo piece. So, but there's an ambiguity set up there, which for me, it actually empowers a lot of post-war German sculpture. It certainly empowers Harold's work. There's almost an insistence on not being specific, like unspecific objects or unspecific object relations that, you know, maybe it goes back to Harold's openness with his students. Maybe there's an open-ended aspect to presenting an ambiguous situation that, you know, allows the viewer to kind of make up their own scale relationships. I don't think it needs something else, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I am interested in that, actually, that, I mean, there's one, like always the word of unattachment, and then just going to say, yeah, there is, the viewer has has an idea of what it is, and then can think about it, but then where do we go with our own thoughts? No, and how much can we take away from what we see? So
right. And the other
it's always,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, but there is this back and forth of thinking, assuming, seeing, being thrown back, moving forward. So there's a lot of movement while looking.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, one could actually conceive of that as political statement too, you know, like the openness, the radical openness of that. Certainly for people like Kippenberger and Olin and Harold, for that kind of political openness and ambiguity was something that they were opposing to, you know, both the history of Germany during World War II, but also the post-World War II kind of cultural, perhaps orthodoxy, you know, in West Germany. Anyway, I don't want to get too far off on that, but the other aspect that we did discuss in our meeting, Esther, is your relation to mold making. So maybe if we can bring it back to a discussion of like the material processes that you that entail your practice, then we can also address some of those issues of ambiguity and openness. Because the mold, you know, we had this long discussion about mold making, and mold, the casting and the mold has its own kind of, you know, aesthetic regime, you know, has its own aesthetic regime.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've been making molds for a long time, but always I think about, why am I doing molds? Because I sometimes need them, but I usually only do them to cast something once. So it's already not so efficient, the mold.
Right.
And then the molds are so poorly made that, yeah, I can also, I mean, maybe, I don't know if, because I use them only once, I don't have to make them perfectly strong, so I can reuse them. So then there's even more chances of them breaking in the process. And yeah, but I like that there is a chance of a different outcome, because then I feel like there's one part I control and one part that is very important, that it is a certain way, and the rest is kind of can go a little bit this direction or another direction.
Right.
And yeah, and then there is there's already a distance between the sculpture and myself.
Right, and there's, yeah, so we did just touched on that a little bit about the distancing aspect of like a cast, you know, as opposed to,
right.
And you know, I mean, it goes all the way back to Duchamp's Malick molds, and you know, the analogical use of molds as a distancing allegorical element, you know, which is an additional content, but the content is based on its material translation. So, and that brings me to thinking to something I mentioned to you also, is that the idea of alchemy, the alchemical translation of, you know, one material into another. So this, I don't know what the material was originally on this piece on the floor, but it's cast in bronze. Okay, so it's wax cast into bronze.
Right. Yeah, and it's a lost wax. It's a sun cast. So there is one, and there is in total 5 floor pieces, and they're all individual.
Okay, Anya, can we look at a couple of the other pieces in this series? Not that it's a series, but yeah. So here's the other scale relationship. I was mentioning, like, you know, an obstacle course for an equestrian competition, but you know, that was just my anecdotal memory coming to play. So there's a dialectical relationship between the cast pieces, which are translated from wax into bronze, and then the a provisional aspect of these bamboo and dowel, painted dowel pieces. So there's a temporal dilation. There's an extension of time between, so it's not just a spatial extension or tension. There's a temporal dimension or dilation between these, you know, otherwise timeless bronze objects and the provisionality of the materials of that small fence or barrier.
What happened with this 3 pieces is that I started really thinking about the scale in the beginning, and then I was drawing on the floor, and these drawings on the floor, they became the bronzes. And at the same time, I've made sculptures that are kind of standing monolithic sculptures that I've done before, but just much smaller. And I was thinking about this very kind of conceptually, you know? And then when the bronzes arrived from the foundry and I had them next to the sculptures, it was horrible. It was completely not working. Mm-hmm. Like everything I envisioned in terms of scale was just really in my head and had nothing to do with the reality of what there was.
Right.
So I took the sculptures really fast and put them to the side. And then I started to think again, okay, what is it? You know, what is the fragility, the scale, and everything started from scratch again. But because I had the structure, like let's say the structure is the bronzes, upon this structure, then I was able to think about what it actually needed, this idea of scale and shift that I was looking for.
Right.
So that was interesting, you know, to somehow have a structure that I was more familiar, because I am more familiar with kind of a little bit larger sculptures from the recent years, even though smaller scale has always existed along the way. But then it felt I needed this structure really in order to start playing again. Right.
And there is kind of a presiding spirit of play in the show, I must say. You know, if we switch from this image to the image of the red cardboard piece, the circular cardboard piece, Anya. Yeah, okay, yeah, that one. So here we see like a radical provisionality. You have, you know, just this cardboard painted red with this string tying it together. Again, like my anecdotal elusive, you know, imagination made me think of like party favors or maybe like folkloric, you know, temporary things that you create at a carnival or something like that. But they are like radically provisional, and they don't include some of those timeless qualities like the bronze pieces. So for me, this piece was kind of a key piece in being transparent in your provisional process. You know, the one you just described, the one where you're thinking on your feet, and you know, there's a kind of pragmatism that goes along with that.
Yeah, you know, when we talked about this, I enjoyed talking about what is maybe the model for the other, and what do we see as complete, and what do we see as maybe not finished yet, you know?
Yes, yeah, and we had we actually tied it together, so it was kind of performative because it was a little bit loose. So we fixed it, you and I together, which I thought was a nice moment too. Fixed
but
it.
That is what I think often is part of it. The idea of And maybe that goes back to what you mentioned earlier, with the, for example, the sculpture with the white cloth. Is it a model, or where is it? Is it finished? You know?
Right.
And this, when is something finished? You know? And yeah, where is the end to things? I mean, that is. Yeah, it's every time it's a decision, no? When it's finished, and that has something to do with where do the thoughts begin, maybe, because sometimes thoughts can begin at the end of an idea, and then you go backwards in order to construct it, or you start somewhere else and then they go out, and then I think the outcome often can look something provisional.
Right. Again, it's going back to the idea of like spatio-temporal dilation and the open aspect of poetics or art making, you know, that kind of breaks things open and it's less determinist. And, you know, perhaps even idealist, you know. In this, I mentioned, you know, like there's a craft convention for, so like a carpenter, they want to make a curved shape. It's called a kerf. So they'll make these series of cuts called kerfs in order to kind of curve a piece of wood. So an additional dimension of my perception of this piece in particular is that there's a playful aspect in relation to that kind of craft orthodoxy, you know. Maybe, you know, maybe just intuitive. I don't necessarily think you intentionally made that formulation, but you know, if the craft aspect has to follow a certain orthodox process, like the mold making, which you don't necessarily follow an orthodox process either, then going in the other direction implies much more freedom in terms of you know, permutations of creativity or work. So there's a lot of freedom in the show, which I appreciated. Maybe we can take a look, Anya, at the large piece with the hanging loop over it. That's another piece that Esther did. Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good view, I think. The piece on the floor, I think, was cast in concrete, Esther, correct?
Yes, correct.
And then there's the piece on top is cast in aluminum.
Yeah.
But, you know, the thing I noticed about the hanging aluminum piece, which is in, you know, dynamic tension with the floor piece, because you can see them as one piece, correct?
It's one piece, yeah.
The first thing I noticed about the hanging aluminum piece, which might not be able to see too well on the slide, is that there's a certain transparency in the process, because what they're hanging from on the ceiling is it's looks like armature wire. In other words, the type of wire that a sculptor would traditionally use to hide, you know, to make the skeleton for a figurative structure or whatever. But the fact that it was exposed, I felt, was also this kind of a very generous kind of exposure of the process of the, you know, the provisional, again, I hate to use that word so much, but the nature of the process, even though the bottom piece is a cast aluminum, it feels very spontaneous. Like it seemed like a spontaneous decision to just hang that with armature wire, you know, as opposed to, say, something, you know, that was less obvious.
I mean, yeah, it was made with wire and self-drying clay in the original,
right?
And that is the process of how I like to work. It's to wanting to make something and then making it without having to think about how, you know, or how I can make it last. how I can shape it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I mean, originally, I think this is how I came to even making molds, is that when I was working on more these type of monolithic type of larger sculptures, that there is one in the exhibition before that we have also a slide. It's a black sculpture standing in the middle of the room. I would make them out of whatever material, styrofoam, and then add clay, add wood, add like whatever, actually, you know, in order to get to where I wanted to you know, where to the moment where it felt like, yes, there is something that I was looking for somehow that I didn't even, not this piece, it's the from the show Second Future.
That's an earlier piece from
Yeah,
that,
it's an
not
earlier,
this show.
from
Yeah.
a different exhibition. Yeah, that one. And then I would, you know, I could just work however I wanted, and then I make the mold, and then I cast it in one material, and then I would still have everything that I needed during the process. But yeah, the outcome then after it's a stable material, so I don't have to, it's fine, you know, I don't have to worry about how to attach it, how to fix it, how to whatever, you know.
Right. Let's see. Yeah, going back to the molds, and can we go back to that one image of the leaning piece and the concrete piece with the loop above it? This one, yeah. So this is an interesting installation, kind of dynamic, where you know, this kind of installation makes me think of like a minimalist kind of presentation. And with that, you know, like for instance, the piece leaning against the wall, it's propped against the wall. So it made me think of, for instance, Richard Serra's prop pieces. But I also, like with in regards to the molds and the distancing, there's also a theatrics involved in this kind of presentation. And I don't say that like in a negative, critical way, but to kind of underline the idea that sculptures themselves can be seen as props, you know, in a kind of concrete theater. So the viewer walks into the gallery and becomes part of that. You know, they become participants in that concrete theater. And I know Esther, that I think it was last year or 2 years ago that you participated in a show in Cologne.
Yep.
Well, yeah, what was that called? It was
last year.
Right. It was in the it was in a bombed out church, right? That was transformed into an art space, the Kolumba in Cologne.
Kolumba, yeah, it's one part is church, but the museum, then they have built a completely new museum next to it.
Right, because Cologne was basically flattened pretty much during the war, with the exception of the dome in the center. And but in that show, you were grouped together with Anna Teresa Kiersmacher and Richard Tuttle. And you know, Kiersmacher obviously is a choreographer, and Tuttle's work I can see totally vibing with your own in terms of its kind of humble approach towards provisionality and, you know, presentation of materials. But was this the only time that you were I think in the past you've also done work that interfaced with dance and performance. So there is a theatrical element that you've kind of played off of in the past in your work. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's correct. I mean, to this show that happened in Cologne, it was a collaboration between the Kolumba and Tanz Köln. And I was invited to the exhibition to place my work together with Heinz Brelo, who was kind of a center figure of the exhibition. And so yeah, that was a conversation kind of with the he is no longer alive, so it was just really the sculptures. And and then it happened that they asked me if I wanted to work with a dancer, choreographer from Cologne. And then we ended up having 2 large performances there that we would dance, him and I together. Just we would develop it and then dance it also. But it happened actually before, in 2019, I was invited to the CCA in Tel Aviv. And there I really wanted to connect to a dancer, because I knew that they have a very strong dance scene. And the idea was just, it was not to do something completely new and I wanted to change, but it was changing the materiality. Because when I make the sculptures, I move and it's really, let's say, the movement, my movement towards what I make and how I move in the studio. And then, I had so many thoughts about place and empty spaces and having things, placeholders, and how to move through sculptures. And then always, as you said before, the installations where the sculpture might be a prop. And then I started to, so I found a woman, and she's a dancer, and we started to meet in the space of the exhibition, and we would talk about horizontality, coming closer, presence, and all of these things that I concern, and then from these conversations we started to move together. In the beginning, I had the idea that she would maybe move after we would talk, but then also because she really wanted us to move together. And that was a great experience to have very kind of similar intentions that I usually have, but then that the material wouldn't freeze, because with sculptures, usually it freezes at some point. You can make something out of clay, something that is soft, and then it hardens, and then that's it. Or, you cast it or whatever. But then if you work with someone else, it can go on forever. There's not this moment of, okay, now it's done.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned the dancer Yvonne Rainer, and like the whole, the interactivity between minimalism and dance, say like in the Judson Church era.
Yeah.
That was so important to Robert Morris's, the development of Robert Morris's work and his relationship to Simone Forti and the rest of the dancers there, where he actually made props. He made props for instance, like a Carolee Schneemann, or maybe it was his piece that Carolee Schneemann participated in, but like they were actively making props for those situations. And you did mention, you mentioned the word situation in our conversation on Thursday, that you think of your sculptures as setting up situations rather than being just discrete works of art. The other, okay, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, how did we come about this topic?
I think we were just talking about, how you and I were interacting with the pieces in the space, and how, topics would come up, they would just bubble to the surface kind of spontaneously. And, so the sculptures offer the situation to arise.
Right.
That situation to arise. So, maybe, Anya, we can go to the kind of diagrammatic drawing, large work on paper. Might be a good segue for talking about dance. There's another one. Yeah, that one. So we had an interesting discussion about this piece too. And when you were talking about the movement in your studio and how that informs the work, and we talked about, I think in the Kolumba show there, Kiersmacher, both Kiersmacher and Richard Tuttle presented kind of diagrammatic scores. Is that correct? Over the course of that? Yeah. And
yeah, the Kiersmacher also, she had a huge floor drawing where the dancers would dance on.
Right. But it's, it sets up this in this interesting relation to, like, what's the function of a drawing? Is the function of a drawing to represent, a situation, or is it the process of a drawing evidence of a particular movement? I mean, one doesn't necessarily see the movements of the artist in the studio, always transparent in the work, but in this instance, I think you mentioned in our conversation that you were doing a bunch of them. You were doing quite a lot of them, and you were just kind of moving through them, almost as if moving through a series of movements, or scores. So
yeah, no, I was telling you that I used to only make small drawings and only sculpt, and sculpture, and that I was moving to Argentina for half a year, and that I didn't want to make sculptures there, and that I then started to make large drawings to kind of still think about space and presence and placement, without having to make sculptures. And that's how these large drawings kind of started.
And I couldn't help but think also of Joseph Beuys' diagrams on his chalkboard, pieces, which were ostensibly didactic. He was using the form of didacticism, or teaching and didactic, to kind of create these very elaborate drawings that were evidence of his lectures, but they had their own aesthetic quality as well, and you could see that. I think we have an early Beuys drawing, Anya, on the tail end of the slideshow. Yeah, so this is a very early, super early Beuys collage. I chose this one because Esther, you had that. You can't necessarily see it in the slide from that wall piece we just looked at of yours, but there is this large piece of paper that's kind of used almost like whiteout, collage whiteout, to kind of, make that, to edit your piece. But the presentation of a drawing, not necessarily as like a model, but as an experience in and of itself. It's not a study. It's the evidence of an experience, of a situational experience. And so, Beuys is interesting, of course, central character in German art. He also, like you, studied in Düsseldorf at the Kunstakademie, and I believe that Sigmar Polke was one of his students at the Kunstakademie in Düsseldorf. And Sigmar Polke wound up in the Academy of Art in Hamburg, where he taught Georg Herold. So there is this kind of very interesting kind of circular circuit of influence that, it's not necessarily obvious, but with my critical distance, I like making those connections within the context where, if they're appropriate, there's a certain kind of, also in those people, like Herold and Kippenberger, and even to some extent, like the Olin brothers, Marcus and Albert Olin, and there's an ambiguity that we talked about earlier that they set up that is kind of a political a lot of people talk about, Kippenberger's kind of humor and Olin's kind of making bad paintings, but there's a sense of trying to reinvent the form, apart from the association it traditionally has, like association a drawing traditionally has, or a sculpture traditionally has, that's part of the task of being an artist, to reinvent the perception of the form and not just rely upon a tradition of, say, drawing a study. So perhaps that's just a long-winded way for me to ask, if your drawing, if we can go back to that drawing, Anya, if your drawing acts as a study for the sculptures, or if it's a discrete work on its own, like what's the relation between the drawings and the sculptures? If it's not a study for, a sculptural piece.
Yeah, it's definitely not a study.
Okay.
And maybe it's a more, if it were a study, then it were a study for seeing, for tension, for decisions, for experiment, for process, for what is necessary, for what is necessary along the path, what is not necessary, how to get from one place to the next, basically.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, do you think there's, this is kind of a wild question, but do you think there's like a difference between, say, like German pragmatism and American pragmatism? Do you think there's like a difference of like getting from one place to the next? Or if it's just a human thing, putting one foot in front of the other? Is that a crazy question? I'm sorry.
No. Well, I was then also thinking like African pragmatism, like
right,
like any pragmatism, like.
Right. So they might be culturally inflected.
Yeah.
Like Aboriginal.
Yeah. Exactly.
Pragmatism, has to do with the landscape and where the water holes were.
Yeah.
Different kind of mapping.
Yeah, I think like directions of thinking.
Right.
It's like some people they think more in a certain direction, and others think in other directions, and I think that influences a lot how we make things and how we see things, and how we want to find answers on our path.
Right, and of course.
And if we want to find answers, it's like,
right.
I think there it's very I think it's very cultural there, but also very very individual.
Right.
Or how we are trained, or what we want to invite into our world, and how we.
Yeah, I guess I'm always just really curious about how an artist develops subjectively. Like, what is the escape velocity, for instance, of their cultural confinement? And in that escape velocity, do they wind up becoming really accurate critics of their enculturation? It's just a tangent, but yeah. So there was one other artist that you mentioned that I thought it might be good to touch upon. I know we're getting short on time here, but it was the Italian artist Luciano Fabro, and we have one example of his work. So this is, I chose this particular work by Luciano Fabro, who you mentioned you were inspired by as one of the Arte Povera group, who he kind of thinks of himself as a heretic of that group. So, but this one reminded me of like the scale relationships that you set up in some of those floor pieces, and also the kind of measuring devices that he's using. As they seem like an importation of anecdotal elements. Like there's this anecdotal. So like if in your pieces, for me, the anecdote would be the equestrian barrier or the Japanese standard. He also seems to me to be doing something similar with incorporating this measuring devices in relation to just these kind of very material marble posts. So, I mean, maybe you can just talk about your relationship to Luciano Fabro, since you mentioned him in our conversation.
Well, actually, there's not that much to say, because when we were talking about Arte Povera, and then I mentioned that every time I've seen works by him, I was drawn to it, But yeah, that's actually it. But it's not like it's not for me that I don't know. I have like reflected upon his work in a way of, wow, I see similarities, or I would like to draw from, certain ideas.
There was a feature in the Brooklyn Rail in 2018 in which there are a few quotes. It was a critical a critics page by Sharon Heckler, and there's a great quote by Lawrence Weiner about Luciano Fabro, and he says, "I was always excited by the fact that he could turn tinsel into substance." So again, it made me think of like the alchemical translation, that a lot of those, Arte Povera, there's a metaphysical aspect to Arte Povera that in some of the conversations that, were in that feature, Fabro talked about metaphysics. I don't necessarily see that in your work, but maybe it's there. Or is that too romantic? You think that's too romantic, the idea of the metaphysics? Metaphysics of material, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, it's one of those, art. It's one of those questions I think art historians like to banter about.
Do you think it's there?
Only in the sense I think of that, there's something, I told you I have a lot of experience in mold making myself, for some other thing that I've done. And there's kind of a childlike, when you take something out of a mold, there's kind of a childlike surprise, that you get when you see the piece cast. It's like kind of magical. And maybe just on that level, like the metaphysics of mold making and how that, can make something timeless, in the kind of magical alchemical process that happens between a mold and a cast. I do see you intimately involved in that process as not just material, but also content. I do see your work as,
Yeah, then it's also like, is it surprise, like, because taking it out of the mold, it's surprise. And what is surprise to us? Where do we place surprise in front of us?
Right.
Can we appreciate the surprise?
Well, that's a great place, I think, to wrap this up. And thank you so much for your patience and your considered answers. I think we'll move to the question and answer section now.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions from the audience. So thank you, Tom and Esther. our first question will be coming from Brian Hamilton Chadwick, and you should be able to turn on your microphone.
My microphone work?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, thank you so much for this lovely talk, everybody. I just wanted to hear in her own words, you know, why she worked on these, what sort of moved her to create these specific works as opposed to some other pieces that could have come up. What is causing this work to come out of you? Is there something you could say about that?
Like which work is in specific?
All the work,
No,
the work.
or in general, the work
yeah,
I
in
made.
general, like, you know, you're an artist, you can make absolutely anything in the world, right? With using any material that your imagination can come up with. I'm just curious if there's a story behind these or some, you know, something that's causing this particular work to come out of you.
Well, I think it comes a lot from the interest in energies between people and between like seeing what there is already in the world. You know, it's not an idea of, oh, I want to invent completely new things, but it's a lot of is seeing and then removing from what there is. Does this make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brian, for that question. I don't know, just follow up. Our next question will come from Lynn Crawford. And you can turn on your microphone now.
Thank you. This was absolutely mesmerizing. And I love the horizontal, vertical. It's like going across time versus possibly sort of stopping in a moment of time. And but what I was going to ask you actually is, were these pieces titled in English or German, and did you translate them?
English.
Okay. Does that make a difference for you when you title something in English as opposed to your?
No, because I title in English, I title in whatever, Italian or Spanish or German, you know, it depends the situation.
You're fluid.
Not really, but
it's fantastic. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Really, really beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Our next question will be coming from G.E. Schwartz. You can turn on your mic.
Yes, thank you so much, Esther. Thank you, Tom. My question is pretty simple, I think, but maybe not. What is the role of repetition in your work? And is the repetition there to create a kind of sequencing or rhythm?
Did you see a lot of repetition now in the images you've seen?
Well, I see some, you know, especially some of the cast pieces. I'm seeing, you know, some aspects of repetition in making multiples, for example, and the fact that multiples on the floor are sort of kind of in conversation with each other, this kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, you mean these bronze?
The bronze pieces, especially, there? Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, there it was. Yeah, originally, I think, yeah, I wanted to have, how to explain best, when it's almost the same, but not really the same,
exactly.
Because they are not really the same, then something shifts, and then you can see what shifts, and you can see what there is there then. Maybe therefore, not to be immersed in that. And now I use the word situation that we were talking about earlier. Does it make sense?
Yes, it does. And then I also see, you know, with that kind of repetition, but also because of it, kind of a rhythmical kind of play there, you know.
Yeah, I guess like there is this very just visual concept also, you know, while making, it's like, well, the idea of well, the scale and the repetition, but then there's also just a drawing on the floor, so it has all of these aspects. I guess. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, GE and Esther, for your beautiful answer. Our next question is from Marie Brickdahl.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, when you make your show, do you think so much about the floor? Because you have this wooden floor, and that really engages with the material so much. If it was a concrete floor, would you do things differently?
So I had one time a situation where I had two exhibitions very close to each other, and one was a concrete floor and one was a wood floor. And then I was thinking about what type of works I wanted to show together. And I was thinking very clearly about that a certain type of pieces I really didn't want to show on the wood floor, for example. And but in the end, it's a decision of then not showing something or showing it. And in the case of this exhibition now, I was a little bit worried in the beginning about the floor, and because the floor in my studio is radically different, you know, but it's very, very, very different. So I was a little bit nervous, but in the end, it's totally fine for me. It's good. I like it. I like that it is this way and that it's very close. The color is very close. It's kind of, it sits very, kind of very firmly, you know, it merges a little bit, and I don't have a problem with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I always think that there might be, you know, the possibility to see the work elsewhere, and then the floor would change, so that the sculptures, they have to adapt also.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Esther. Our final question will come from our publisher, Fang Wei.
Thank you, Anya. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Tom. I can't wait to see the show. And upon hearing back and forth answers to Tom's long questions, often, it makes me think about also relationship in between things, you know, the spatial relationship, because as Tom pointed out, the autonomous existence of the drawings that we saw there, whether it's inherent relating to the sculpture or not, but the one thing that we can really might agree upon is that the interval between things in the case of the drawing is the mark making and the line that seem to, you know, point out the distance between where they are located in the page, you know. But where it appears on the sculpture, I always felt like there's an incredible sensitive attention paid to the interval between them.
Yeah, exactly.
Space is so intense. I mean, the interval or negative space, wherever it is, to me, where the bamboo erected construction, how long and how far or how close to the floor piece, I think that spatial relationship is so incredibly important to how we look at them and see them as a total experience, as a total situation. So my question is very simple, Esther. I could only imagine that each of them will demand different kind of spatial relationship. And it's very hard to articulate about space because, as you mentioned, that your studio have different kind of spatial environment than it is in the gallery at Peter Blum. So I wonder, whatever that you might have already conceptualized when you make the piece in the studio, would that once installed in the gallery, you might change the perception of that interval, the space in between the object. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, it is. But yes, it is absolutely. For example, the pieces on the floor, the grouping.
Yeah.
They have each the space that they need, that cannot shift, because yeah, they're as much as the positive space, the you know, the material that we see, and the negative space, they're equal. And so that can only be that way. What is interesting sometimes is when there's there's the space that we see inside, but that we see from one to the next, but then there's also from where it ends to maybe the wall, I don't know, you know. And then when we are looking at one, we step back and we are already in the space maybe of the next one. You know, so there are we stepping in the space of one sculpture while looking at another one, and how do we then move around them? But and that is what I'm interested in the drawing a lot. But in terms of the space, also the space between the hanging sculpture and the concrete floor piece, yeah, it's the same, because it's the tension between the two pieces. Yeah. And I am really, really, really focusing on these things.
That's great. You know, years ago, I remember reading a wonderful, lengthy essay by Barbara Rose, one of our great critics who passed away a year and a half ago. One of our dear, very beloved friend in the rail. She wrote this incredible essay by arguing that without Mondrian, you know, his synthesis of the horizontal and vertical formation, which essentially eliminate the idea of the frame, you know, in Western painting. Mm-hmm. Without Mondrian invention, Pollock's painting would not be possible. It was a very beautiful, I would say, meditation on the relationship between the two, in the sense that Pollock, by making the work on the floor, able to also expand the boundary of the painting into, of course, happenings and other form of performative nature of art as we know it. So my question is also very simple. If one were to ask you, Esther, you might or might not answer, or you might answer in very poetic term, which you have already a few times throughout this conversation here. I noticed the relationship between what is on the floor horizontally and what is vertically, what is erect. Again, it's a very tenuous, sensitive dialogue of the two. So what are you thinking about the you know, the relationship between horizontal and vertical formation or movement in general, you know?
Yeah. I think maybe we consider horizontal always or most often with stillness, and the verticality we consider, we see more movement in it. And then, yeah, by but then there is a lot. There's a lot to experience in the stillness of the horizontal, and there is a lot of movement in the stillness of that. So, and I have been so much interested in the movement of the energy in that comes from horizontal sculpture or from anything horizontal.
Got it. I like that.
Because our relationship to vertical is very awake, you know, and everything that is horizontal, it's so different. Like it touches us on a very different level, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fong, for your excellent questions. And thank you, Esther. Thank you again, Tom, for this presentation today. This has been wonderful. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending these events with a poetry reading. So today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate, Abigail Welhouse, to the stage. Abigail Wellhouse is the author of the poetry chapbooks Small Dog, Too Many Humans of New York, and Bad Baby. She is also the author of Memento Mori, a poem-comic collaboration with Evan Johnston. Her poems have been published in The Toast, Flapper House, Ghost Ocean Magazine, and elsewhere. So please, Abigail, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you to everyone at Brooklyn Rail for inviting me to read, and Esther for your beautiful art and conversation with Tom, and for all of you for being here. So I do have a new chapbook out this week called Small Dog. So I'll be reading some poems from that. And it's very possible that you may hear a little bit of accompaniment from the real life small dog, who we will see how he goes with that. So I'll start with a poem called Dogs Are Good for You. Dogs are good for you. My dog is curled up on his cot like a cashew, nose touching tail. Dogs are good. And dogs are good for you. Did you know people with dogs have lower rates of heart disease? Of course, we don't know if this is because healthier people are more likely to feel that they can get a dog, or because having the dog is good for your heart, because of taking walks and petting for stress relief, except then you worry because your dog eats a piece of garbage on the sidewalk and it's stressful, and worry is bad for you. So maybe dogs are bad for you. But it also lowers stress if you pet your dog, unless your dog isn't in the mood to be pet and he growls at you, and then you feel rejected. And aren't all dogs supposed to love you all the time? But he licks your face right after he ate garbage, and that's supposed to be good for your microbiome or something. But also, aren't garbage bacteria disgusting and disease causing? But then again, it makes you think that maybe you don't need to be perfect to be loved. And maybe there's a God who watches you do your human equivalent of eating garbage off the sidewalk and still thinks you're good. So that was one of the things that really struck me about getting this particular dog. He's a rescue, and he is a Brooklyn dog. He's from Sean Casey Animal Rescue in Brooklyn. And he is a complicated guy. And there's something that has been a lot for me to experience, of just realizing that there's this imperfect creature that's a little neurotic guy, and I love him so intensely, and sort of changes the way you think about, you know, relationships with people too, and the way you love people and creatures. So one common theme you'll find in these poems is my dog eating garbage. So here's another poem where that comes up, and it's called My Little Dog and I. My little dog and I walk up 4th Avenue. We are punctuation in other people's days. The barber nods to me sometimes. The men, serious in their chairs. My little dog walk by in all weather at all times. Sometimes we wear matching raincoats, other times bundled tight. My little dog finds chicken bones on the sidewalk and eats them in one gulp. He finds fruit, yogurt, paper that once wrapped fish. He finds God knows what. God knows. One day I cried to the priest for help, and he brought a ladder to my window. I wore a white dress and ascended carefully. I crawled through the window, and there he was, waiting and shaky, half-tongue. My little prince, both rescuer and rescued. So this poem I got a text about from my parents, arguing about the interpretation of it, whether it was literal or figurative. And it is in fact based on a true story where I got locked out of my apartment. And for any of you, if you know the Sunset Park area in Brooklyn, The priest at St. Michael's helped me break into my own apartment. So that's what inspired that poem. This one's called Sometimes Rarely. Sometimes, rarely, it's too early for the dog to want to walk. So he just looks at you, big-eyed, until you bribe him with a treat. You were up too late last night, allowing horses to run. Sleep lives in your eyes. You would trade your kingdom for coffee and a bagel. The loved human sleeps, and you are sleepy and foolish from too much time on the train, or just enough, or not enough, or what is enough, covered in horsehair and dog hair, and oh Lord, this is holy. So one of the things I really enjoyed about the conversation and looking at Esther's art too was hearing Tom's references to reminding him of the horse culture and equestrian culture. And that's a culture that I'm very much a part of too. I teach riding lessons, and also my dog does agility. So I think of the tiny fences that he jumps over like a little horse too. So I'm going to read one more poem to finish. This one's called We Love the Neighbors. And again, thanks for listening. And this is Small Dog, which is just out this week. So I'm excited to be able to share it with you. This poem is called We Love the Neighbors. Every time there is a noise in the hallway, I feed my dog a treat. We love the neighbors, I say. We love them. We love the mailman. We love how the mailman brings us mail. He looks at me quizzically. He's not convinced, but sometimes he'll swallow a woof for a Cheerio. Later, when we're trying to sleep, a man talks on the phone beside our bedroom window. I half listen to his conversation half. And when I feel a bark rise up in my throat, I think instead, we love the neighbors, and it works. Thank you very much for listening. Appreciate everybody.
Thank you so much, Abigail, for your beautiful reading. And thank you again, Esther and Tom. We also would like to thank Peter, David, and Pete from Peter Blum Gallery for helping to make today's event possible. We encourage everyone to view our archive of these conversations. They're up on our YouTube channel. We'll upload this conversation shortly. And you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Julie Rummel and David Rhodes on the event of Uncle at Bureau. We'll conclude with a poetry reading by Ellie Parker. And you now can turn on your microphones to say thank you and goodbye. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you
so much, Abigail. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Anya.
Abigail.
Thanks, Anya.
Thank you, Ty.
Hey, Charlie.
And thank you, Abigail.
Thank you.
This was really great. Thank you.
Thank you all for joining.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Esther.
Thanks, Esther. Hey, Fawn.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can't wait to see the show. Go see the show, you guys.
It's beautiful, beautiful stuff.
We talked and now we have to look. That's Mile. Congratulations, Esther. On the
Thank
show.
you. Thank you to the little dog.
Yeah.
Oh, look, the dog.
Got to make a little appearance at the end.
Thank you so much. Hey, Jeffrey.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks.
Thanks, Esther.
Thank you all. Have a
Thank
good
you for
day.
everyone for participating.
Go see
Thank
the
you,
show.
Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Take care. Be safe,
Bye,
everyone.
all.
Stay
Okay.
warm.
Bye. Stay warm, you guys. Be safe. Ciao.